Good afternoon, everybody. This is Steve Wilson from the University of Illinois at the State Water Survey, and this is our monthly webinar. This month is My Water Safe to Drink? Common Questions About Private Wells. If you have questions during the presentation, you can put them in the question box. We've got 4 other staff on the call, if you will. Dan Webb and Chuck Curtis, chemists here at the Water Survey, are here to help answer questions related to treatment and chemistry and disinfection and some of those things. And Jennifer Wilson and Katie Hollenbeck from the Water Resources Center are here to help take your questions. They're the other half of our private well class team, if you will. This is a joint project between the Water Survey and the Illinois Water Resources Center at the U of I. I want to mention first off that this project is funded by US EPA through a grant to the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, and we're a partner to RCAP, who are the lead on this project. Yeah, so I'm getting ahead of myself already. The webinar materials follow our course, which is available at privatewellclass.org. It's 10 lessons. There's also videos, podcasts. The webinars are recorded, and they're available there, and I'll talk about some of that at the end. What we're going to do today, this webinar is really meant to be just about questions that you've posed to us, and we'll answer as many of those as we can today. I can tell you we won't get to all of them. We had 236 folks register, and probably at least half had a question that they would like answered. We are developing a page on our website to get at more of those answers and provide them. That probably won't be launched until later this spring or early this summer. But when it's ready, it will have most of the questions that folks have been asking us over the last several years through our webinars and also from our phone line and our email address. So if you haven't asked a question and you have one, Katie and Jennifer are watching the question box, and feel free to type a question in there. At the end, we'll take a short break to look through those, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can. So yeah, this says we received over 50 questions. That was from as of last week. We've got another probably 50 since then as more people register. I've already mentioned all the folks here. Okay, so things to remember about private wells. Private wells aren't regulated, so it's up to you as a homeowner or a user, if you're renting a property that has a well, to be sure your water's safe and that the system's maintained. That's really a big deal. If you live in the city, then you've got a community water supply. I live in Champaign, or actually Savoy, Illinois. I pay $40 to $50 a month for my water supply, and there's about 150,000 residents that use Illinois Americans' water, and so that cost is spread out among 150,000 people. That allows them to have the infrastructure, the testing, the licensed operator, all the staff, and everything else they need to be sure that our water is safe and it meets all the federal regulations for drinking water. With a private well, you won't have any regulations. You don't have any regulations that you have to meet, and so you're on your own basically to take care of those things yourself. And our class is designed to help you become a better steward of your well for maintenance and for ensuring the quality is good enough for drinking water and protect your family. And so the thing to remember is, you know, the clearest glass of water isn't always the safest. It can be colorless, contaminants can be, or odorless, or have no taste. You can't go by the way it looks or even how it feels or tastes. And so it's always best just to get your well tested. And that's certainly one of the messages we highlight throughout all this. And so the idea behind our class and these webinars is to help you become more aware, understand the issues related to your well. If you understand your well log, and some of this is based on the class materials that we won't cover today, but are in the 10 lessons that you can take, then you have a better sense of where your water's coming from. You know, a shallow well has more risk, if you will, from surface contamination than a deeper well. Knowing what kind of aquifer your water is coming from, is there arsenic or is it high in iron, or you know what contaminants there might be that are naturally occurring. And so that information guides you for testing and also possibly for even treatment if you have things like high arsenic, which is naturally occurring in many parts of the country. So by taking the class and participating in these webinars, hopefully it helps you understand your well and your aquifer better so that at least you can ask better questions and the right questions to your health department and extension, your state agencies that have more specific site information related to your situation. So again, sample your well. You should do that annually. That's one way to make sure that nothing's changed with your water quality and that you know your water is safe to drink. So there's always a lot of questions every month on testing, and so if you've been on several of our webinars, you may have seen some of this material, but these questions come up every time. You know, how do I collect a sample? What do I test for? Where should I get it analyzed? You know, what do I do with that? And that's really the big thing. And so we're going through each of these and other questions that have come in. We've combined some questions where they're very similar, and again, we'll answer as many of the questions that we've received from you folks prior to the webinar as we can. We won't get through them all. So where do you collect your sample? Usually you collect it from your kitchen tap, and the thing to remember is that the water coming out of your kitchen tap or any of the taps in your home could actually be different than the water that's coming out of your well. And that's because when water comes to the surface and it sits in your pipes, it could change the chemistry. Maybe it's exposed to air, or maybe you have older pipes. And so what our lab does, which Dan, who's on the call, runs our public service lab, when well owners in Illinois call him and say, you know, what do I need to sample for? Here's my situation. They ask questions. Do you have treatment? And how old's your home? If it's possible you have lead pipes, which lead was outlawed in 1986, then you may collect a second sample or do a first draw and a later sample. And also if you have any treatment, that certainly changes the water. So the water at an outside spigot that's right next to your well may really be natural water quality in the ground, but it may not be what your drinking water quality is if you've run it through a softener or a filter or an RO system, or if it's just water that's set in your pipes for overnight. That can cause things to leach out in certain types of pipe and cause those types of situations. So you need to understand those issues as far as, do you have treatment? You need to talk to the lab about that when you go to a lab. And most of the time you're sampling from your kitchen tap if that's where you're getting your drinking water. But again, you know, that as an example, if you have a POU unit that's point of use, that would be like an RO system that's at your kitchen sink, and you're getting your drinking water from that, then the water from your bathroom and the sink in your bathroom hasn't gone through that RO unit, and so the water quality will be different versus if it's a point of entry device that you have for treatment. That means that it's on your, that would be like a softener usually, so or any other device that's before it goes, or a filter that's before your pressure tank. Then it's filtering all the water that goes into the house, and then all the water should be similar in quality. And again, a good lab will provide detailed instructions for that. So what do you test for? Many of these things, it really depends on your unique situation, how deep your well is, you know, the formation, meaning the geologic formation that your water is coming from, and how, if there are any known contaminants in the area. You know, if you're right next to a gas station, for instance, and you may want to consider sampling for VOCs versus, you know, in a rural area, your well's fairly deep and you have, you know, 100 feet of casing, then you're less likely to have surface influence, and so that makes a difference on what you need to sample for. Wells can be breached, however, so that's why many counties and states recommend testing for nitrate and coliform every year. The idea behind coliform bacteria itself is not harmful to you. It's E. coli that's dangerous. But coliform, if you have coliform in your well, it's a simple test and it's very cheap, and it's an indicator that there's a pathway into your well from the surface. So if you have coliform in your well, then you should test for E. coli as a follow-up, and then you know there's a situation. Either you have a shallow well and water from the water table or from near the surface is getting in your well, or there's some other situation like, you know, somebody's hit a mower, used a mower and hit the side of your casing and cracked it, or, you know, a tractor's run over your casing, or, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why maybe your well cap isn't on properly. There's a lot of things that can cause contaminants to get in your well if your construction's not proper and your well's not maintained properly as well. Another theme through a lot of this and through our class lessons is that you should always go to your county and state health department for advice. They're health professionals. They're here to help ensure that your drinking water is safe for your family. In nearly every state and every county, they have no authority to tell you you can't use your well. They might recommend you don't use your well if there's a certain problem as far as water quality, but it's really on you whether you use your well or not. So other folks you can talk to, Co-op Extension is a good example. Many times, because they're working with a lot of the folks in rural areas, they already know the water quality issues, or they're maybe even putting on workshops in some areas for private well owners. Talk to your local driller, your neighbors, and if your state has a good system for their well records where they're available online, you might be able to talk to those folks as well. I already mentioned coliform and nitrate here. So we're going to go right to questions that we've received. Some of these I put out of order based on how we received them, but they fit in to this overall theme of testing and disinfection and all that stuff. So, when should you test your well? Well, you should test your well annually, as we already mentioned, anytime the well's been opened. And if you've had to disinfect your well because you've had a bacteria problem, then you should certainly do a follow-up sample to be sure your well water is still safe, or it is now safe to drink. Sometimes bacteria problems can be reoccurring because there's a constant source. Maybe your well is too close to your septic system, and now there's a pathway from one to the other underground in the aquifer. They're close together, they're shallow, whatever the situation might be. And so now no matter how many times you shot chlorinate your well, you're likely to have more bacteria problems if that's the case. And also, after an emergency response event like a flood or fire, this is just an example of a well casing after a fire, and I forgot to put the credit on here. It's we got this from Colorado, one of the counties there where they've had a lot of forest fires, and you can see the melted casing top and the wiring. That's an obvious example, but anytime if your water's been overtopped by flood, a lot of times a well may be in a bottom ground near a small creek or stream, and those in the spring, if it floods, you're more prone to have water get in your well from the surface, which is likely going to have bacteria in it. So any situation where you're concerned at all, that's probably a good idea to test your well. What we suggest, and this is based on looking at a lot of different states and a lot of county health departments and what they recommend, annually for coliform and nitrate, and then initially in every 3 to 5 years for this other list here that includes fluoride, iron, lead. If you have galvanized pipe, zinc and cadmium, arsenic, chloride, these things in the middle especially kind of give you a picture of the water quality in general of the aquifer that you're getting your water from. And things like arsenic, for instance, I've done a lot of work looking at arsenic in Illinois. If a well has high arsenic, say 40 or 50 ppb, which the standard for community water supply is 10, if we go back 2 years later and sample that water, it's very likely to be within 10% of the same value. Groundwater doesn't change that much, especially if it's an aquifer, a sand and gravel aquifer, a bedrock aquifer. It stays fairly consistent. So the TDS should be similar, the chloride should be similar, the hardness should be similar, the arsenic should be similar. And so by testing every 3 to 5 years, if the pH has changed significantly or anything else has changed significantly, that likely means that there's been some sort of change, either in the aquifer or in your well. Maybe there's a casing that's come loose at a weld or whatever that's changed the chemistry of your well, and that's an indicator that you need to be more aware and maybe sample again. Those values should stay pretty consistent over time. Regardless of what we recommend, you should always take even this list to your county or state health department and ask them what they recommend. And there's different levels of sampling that can be done. You can just sample for coliform and nitrate, and that tells you whether there's any pathway from the surface, but it isn't going to tell you if there's naturally occurring arsenic in your well from the aquifer. So if on the extreme end, the EPA has about 90 contaminants that a community water supply has to test for and make sure that they are under certain limits for. But to test for all those things would probably cost $3,000 or $4,000, and that's not practical either. A lot of them are surface contaminants from industrial uses that in most areas you wouldn't be concerned about. So go to your county or local state health department, and they can certainly give you a good feel for those things. So where do you get it analyzed? Well, every state accredits labs, and so what we recommend nationally is that you try to use one on the list. And I say that with Dan and Chuck here Our lab isn't accredited anymore, mainly because of the reporting requirements and the staffing requirements to do so. We follow all the EPA protocols and methods for duplicates and blanks and all the things that, we can verify that the work we're doing is quality work, but we're not on that list for Illinois, though a lot of well owners in Illinois use us. And so overall, though, by picking a lab that's accredited by your state, that means that any community water supply can use them for their compliance samples, which they have to do monthly for the EPA regs and for the Safe Drinking Water Act. But it also means that they pass certain criteria that show that they do quality work, and they meet certain thresholds for having blanks and duplicates that can replicate their work and all that. So you're always better using an accredited lab. And you might want to talk to your county or your state health department or even extension. Some states have programs for private well sampling. I know Iowa does. They have a grants to counties program that their state legislature funds that allows their counties to offer reduced sampling. Different states may have different programs available, and you should check into those before you go any further. New Jersey has a program that's required by law. Anytime you sell your property, you have to have a water sample taken by the state if the property has a private well on it. And from that, they gather a lot of data about the quality of the aquifer in New Jersey, and they know a lot about it. They do about 13,000 samples a year. So a good lab will give you the instructions you need. They'll ask good questions, about your situation, if it's well water, all those sorts of things. And they'll either send you or have you come in and get a kit and where you should sample and all those things. If you aren't satisfied with a particular lab, or they can't answer your questions, or they say, well, you should know what you want to test for, and maybe you do if you've done the legwork, but they should have some idea. And if not, I'd find a different lab. And again, a lab should provide the bottles and everything you need. They're doing you a service, but you're paying for it, and so you're the customer, and I would make sure you're satisfied with the results and their expertise, if you will. As far as interpreting results, and I'm going to show you a good example of this, there are websites and documents online that explain the EPA's MCLs, maximum contaminant levels, that they allow for a community water supply. But in the end, you should always take your results to a health department to get a qualified answer. They're health professionals, and there are a lot of things that can go wrong using these websites. You can slip units and put in the wrong units, and so it sounds an alarm that's not there. All those sorts of things. And so you're better off taking your sample results in the end, to a qualified health professional to give you some advice. If you do find something, we always recommend resampling. Anyone can make an error. The best lab in the world or the best sampler in the world may, accidentally contaminate a sample, or they may do something that gives a false positive. And so if you do find a contaminant in your well of concern, we would recommend you always resample to confirm it's really there. And if you sample for bacteria, coliform bacteria, then you should also do an E. coli test, and to be sure you don't have E. coli, but you should boil your drinking water until you can chlorinate or disinfect your well. This is one of those sites I just mentioned. The New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services just released this 3 or 4 months ago, I believe. It's called the Be Well Informed Guide. It's a website that has a tool built into it that you can type in your sample results, and it'll give you information about what those results mean. This is for residents in New Hampshire, and the advice here is for New Hampshire residents and even the constituents, if you will, in the, what things you can put into the tool as far as what contaminants, arsenic, lead, turbidity, whatever, are based on what they recommend that well owners test for. So you may have things on your sample analysis that are different, but this is really kind of an informational guide as far as what your results might mean. And this tool takes it a step further and actually provides some suggestions for possible treatment, which is where the big step, if you will, based on some of the tools that are out there previously, or there, still are, but this gives you, so down at the bottom it says enter your water test results. You click on that button, it comes up to a page. There's a disclaimer, make sure and read that. It wants to know what town you're in New Hampshire. but it'll allow you to put anonymous, which is what I did. So I typed in 15 micrograms per liter, and you can see the green on the micrograms per liter there. You can type in the units. You got one of four choices. So if a lab gives you the result in milligrams per liter instead, that would be a 0.015. And so you need to know units, and that's really where a lot of these mistakes are made using these online tools. But here I've typed in 15 micrograms per liter, which is ppb, and the standard is 10. So when I hit submit, first it's going to ask me if I have any other results because I only gave it one thing, but then it's going to go to this result and it tells you this value exceeds the drinking water standard. Now, when you read that, as a well owner, a private well owner, you have no drinking water standard. Legally, you can drink this water if you want to. There are many people out there who would say this probably isn't that risky. It's just above the standard. 10 years ago, the standard used to be 50. That's not a judgment on the arsenic value. I'm just saying that a community water supply that had 15 micrograms per liter would have to treat their water to get it under 10 before they could serve it to their customers. Whether you do that is up to you. The reason the drinking water standards are used as a surrogate from private wells, like New Hampshire's using that for the site, is because it's what's considered safe by the EPA, and so it's probably, you want to have your water sample results under these limits. Just then there's some semblance of safety as far as the contaminant that you're drinking. And so it recommends treatment. You can see here it talks about point of view or POU or absorption or reverse osmosis. Actually, this is a question that's going to come up later on that Chuck and Dan answered that I have on here. But it gives you advice, and there is even you can click on some of these websites that it links to here at the bottom to get more information. So here's the interpretation of the results. So it provides you a lot of good information. You can see at the bottom, I didn't enter a chloride value, I didn't enter a copper value, any of those things. And so it just says one's not entered. But you could enter all of these different constituents, and it'll tell you what a typical health professional would suggest to you for this level of contaminant. So again, as far as interpreting results, these are tools. They're only a guide. And for typical water, a lot of times you find a unique situation, so you should always take your sample results to your health department to get a qualified answer. And some people are skeptical of doing that. They're afraid, well, they're going to tell me I can't use my well. They want to help. They want to ensure your water is safe to drink for you and your family, and they can't tell you to stop drinking your water or condemn your well. They can only recommend action for you. The only cases where that would be different, there are a couple counties I'm not even sure what state, where the county is actually taken upon themselves to require well owners to meet more standards. And it's 2 counties out of the thousands of counties in the United States. Or if your well is part of I'm trying to think of the right term. If your well were part of a contamination spill, maybe a large company had a spill or someone dumped barrels, and there's a plume of contaminant in an aquifer, in that case, the state might come in and say, we're going to treat all this, or we're going to remediate it, or we're going to put you all on city water, but it wouldn't be you alone. And so to say there's no way ever is probably a stretch, but it's in most every case, you're on your own with your drinking water, and the county wants to help you, not try to not have you have a water supply. So you should always go to them first. So one of the other things we get a lot is about well construction. So in most states, there's a well construction code. 2 states don't have it, Pennsylvania and Alaska. There are no set construction codes. I know in Pennsylvania, their Department of Environmental Protection has a recommended construction document that they hope people will use and drillers will use, but their state legislature hasn't passed a law that says you have to follow this code, so they don't. But in every other state, there are construction codes that say, here's the type of material you use, here's minimum setbacks from contaminant sources like septic systems and all those sorts of things. The challenge is many wells were put in before those codes came into effect. In Illinois, that law was passed in the early 60s that said you will file a permit and you'll follow these construction codes, and they've changed over time. So any well that was drilled before the 60s or before any certain change in code, they were just grandfathered in. No one has to go back and make their well meet the current standard. So many of those wells still exist today. many wells are in pits, and there are many hand-dug wells, which are the most vulnerable typically because they're getting water from the water table near the surface. So there's two problems here. One is that many wells don't meet what would be considered safe today because they were drilled or put in before the codes were changed or before there was a code. And two, many of these wells are hand dug. You know, the well I grew up on was hand dug by my grandpa in 1933. I grew up on a small hog farm. That well's still in use today, and it's not very safe. That's the bottom line. And not only are they not safe from a water quality perspective, but many of these old wells, even if you have a new well, you may still have the old well for your garden or for watering livestock or whatever. A lot of times they're not safe at the surface. They don't have proper protection in their large diameter, so they're really a safety hazard. Here's two examples. So this one's from Washington Department of Ecology. There was a piece of plywood over this old well. There's the jet pump, the blue jet pump up on the left. That well, I'm sure the woman walked over that piece of plywood 1,000 times. And this particular time, it broke. She fell in and it killed her. I was in southern Illinois in November at a meeting. I met Don Kelderman. Excuse me. He was researching his family. They had an old plot and farm ground down in southern Illinois. He's traipsing around in the woods and ran across this old well, and there was a dead goat in it. I know that's disgusting, but it certainly emphasizes what can happen. If he wasn't paying attention, that very well could have been him. And it does happen, and they're really a problem. And so having a safe well, what's protected at the surface, is really an important thing. So what to do with these wells? Bring them up to code if you can, especially wells in pits. You talk to a contractor or driller, ask them what it'll take to bring your well up to code, fill in the pit, use a pitless adapter so that, to extend the pipe above land surface, fill that in with grout or clay so that it protects from surface infiltration. And again, talk to a contractor or a well authority. I know in many states, the Stormwater Conservation District may actually even have funding if you have an old hand-dug well that is not in use anymore. It's an improperly abandoned well. I know in Illinois, not currently because we still don't have a state budget from last year, but in a normal year, our Soil Water Conservation District will cost share the cost of sealing an abandoned well. So, moving on. Should I add bleach to my well periodically? So you add bleach to disinfect your well to kill bacteria that might have gotten in your well somehow. And that's where coliform bacteria comes in and all the testing you do. You shouldn't have to disinfect your well unless you have a problem. And so you should always test your well. That's why you test annually. And then if you do have a problem, that's when you should disinfect your well because it means you do have bacterial contamination. So bleach and chlorine is an oxidant, and so it can also release metals that are in the formation, in the aquifer, into the water. I know in some cases you see oxidizing well water causes lead and arsenic and things to be released from the minerals. And so also if you just pour bleach as you buy it in the store like Clorox, that's harsh and it can damage the rubber seals over time, like on your pitless. It can do damage to other pump components. And so you shouldn't just use it periodically to make it safe. If you have a problem, you have to figure out what that is and fix it as far as why is bacteria getting in my well. And if you're going to disinfect, there are procedures in place where you need to mix the bleach with water to get it at a certain concentration. So one, it doesn't damage your well. It's less likely to cause much release of metals, and it also still disinfects like it's supposed to. And we'll go over that, and I said coming up here because there's another question about disinfection, and I'll go through that. One thing, if you do have a recurring bacteria problem, you've shot chlorinated your well several times, and you still get bacteria positives, then you have a more serious issue. Either you have an underground source like your well shallow and it's near your septic system or your leach field, and it's causing, there's a path between your well and some source, or there's an improperly constructed well where maybe water can seep in near the surface and it's near your livestock or those sorts of things, or your septic again. And in those cases, you may need continuous chlorination, or if you could also use UV. This happened. I went to New York last summer to look at some shallow wells where the bedrock aquifer is right at the surface. There are a number of locations where there's homes are really close to each other. They all have septic and they all have shallow wells. And with fractured bedrock, the fractures are the pathway. So once the water gets in one of those and you start pumping a well, it gets drawn in from more of a distance. And, many wells in this one area were showing up with positive E. coli hits. And that's because they're contaminated by their septic system. The only thing you could do there, if you're going to use the well, is to add continuous treatment, whether that be UV or chlorination, to make sure that you're killing the bacteria. So how do you disinfect your well? You can ask your county or your state health department. Most of those will have some sort of guide. Some are more thorough than others. Some talk about things like you should shut the power off and you should be careful about this. And, they look at a more comprehensive approach. We looked through about 50 of those documents, and the one I chose to follow is the Minnesota Department of Health's Well Disinfection Guide. This is a good point to say this webinar will be recorded or is being recorded. And so you'll be able to get to this material and this URL from our website here in a week or so. And so this is a link to it. It's also in our class. We have a list of resources that are used for each lesson. And in lesson 10 on treatment is a link to this. Now they've just recently updated this. When I was looking at this, preparing for this webinar, we had the version of this document from 2012. And in December of 15, they updated it. And so this is a brand new version. It's a little more compact, and it goes step by step through what you need to do, like the safety concerns here at the bottom. It really talks about shutting electricity off and making sure you're doing everything correctly so that you don't shock yourself or you don't cause some kind of problem, as well as you do the chlorination properly. It shows, here's step 5 is mixing a bleach solution. If you know how much water's in your well and the diameter of your casing, it recommends how much you need to use, and you should mix it so that you're only using with 5 gallons of water, like it shows here. And again, that's to make sure the concentration's around 200 ppm, which is what it needs to be. So, because like it says here, if you pour straight Clorox in your well, that actually isn't as good of a disinfection method because it works best at around 200 ppm. So, but this document is online, and that's probably all I'm going to say about that here. If you're going to disinfect your well, if you're uncomfortable at all doing this yourself, then you should talk to a contractor or driller and ask them. They might charge you, or they would probably charge you. Find out what it is, and then you can make that value judgment yourself. But they're experts, if you will, and would be able to do this for you. And you can ask them to follow the same procedure if you like. But if you're uncomfortable opening your well or any of those things, then you should consider an alternative. This is actually from the old brochure, the 2012 one, and I only left it here because it has more information about for water softeners and water treatment equipment. And in the new document, it basically says you should look at your manufacturer's recommendations. And so there's so much treatment equipment out there and so many new versions of different things. I'm sure that's why they've decided this is a lot for them to maintain. And so you should look at, keep that information. If you have treatment, you should have all the information about who you bought your treatment from, and they should be able to help you with how to disinfect that as well. Because you also need to disinfect your treatment equipment if you've had bacteria problems. So on to some other questions. Are there limits on how much water can be pumped from a single well? There's a lot of ways to address this question. It's really open-ended. We weren't sure how this was meant. There's limits based on the aquifer or the water source. If you have a dug or bored well, most of the time you put a dug or bored well in an area where there isn't a real aquifer, and which means you have less water available. So you put a shallow well in that takes water from the water table and stores it. So a dug or bored well is usually at least 3-foot diameter, and the whole point of that is that it creates a storage mechanism. So you have the well itself becomes the source of your water, where in a sand or gravel aquifer or a bedrock aquifer, you might have a 4-inch well or a 5-inch well, and if in a sand and gravel aquifer, you have a screen and the water can readily flow through that. So you might be able to pump hundreds of gallons a minute, because that's how much is in the aquifer. Where if you have a dug or bored well, you might be limited. I know as an example, our well was only 14 foot deep and it was 4 foot diameter, and it was all hand brick, uncemented, so water seeped in from near the surface. And it was all clay soil. If I put a hose in our horse tank and forgot about it, and the next day all of a sudden we had no water, our well was dry for a couple days, it would start seeping back in slowly. In the beginning, our water would be muddy, really not something you'd want to drink, and until that had time to fill back in. So for that side of things, it really depends on whether your water source is an aquifer or if you have a dug or bored well that's getting water from the water table. It might limit you that way. Just knowing your pump size. Most home installations will have a pump that's maybe 25 gallons a minute at most. If you're in an area where you have very low producing wells, as low as 2 or 3 gallons a minute or less, you might have a pump that's really throttled back that way, and maybe it only pumps 2 or 3 gallons a minute. So that ensures that the water in the well doesn't ever drop below the pump and risk burning up your pump. So you may have a limit that way, or maybe someone gave you a pump, you put it in not really knowing how big it was, and now you don't have enough water. It might be the pump size. The last way this could be answered to me was limits on regulation. You know, in many of the western states where there's western water law, it's the law of first right, and so private wells are pretty much exempt, but they're also limited. I talked to the state of Washington just to ask what they do, and their Department of Ecology maintains their private well and driller programs, and you're limited to 5,000 gallons a day, which to me, if it's just a home, is a lot of water. You're not going to use 500 gallons in a day. We have a water inventory program here where we estimate pumpage per capita for all the communities in the state, and I would say it's closer to about 100 gallons per day per person for a typical home use. Now, if you have livestock or you're irrigating or you're doing a garden, that sort of thing, then you might need more water. But if you're in a western state where there might be water law that regulates pumpage like that, your best recourse is to contact your state agency. They're very helpful. They'll tell you what the rules are, and yeah, and that's the best way to handle that. So we're getting to some water quality questions, I believe. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read this, but Dan and Chuck, if you will chime in. One of the questions we got, what is the best filtration system to use? Again, this is really open-ended. I wasn't sure if they were talking about actual filtration, like a filter, or if it just meant filtering out contaminants. And, that opens it up to a lot of different types of treatment. So if it is just a filter, if you have silter sediment, and what Dan and Chuck suggest is starting out with a 5-micron filter, see how that works. If it clogs up too fast or you're still getting things through, then you might need to change sizes. And but what it should do is you should maybe need to change filters every couple of the cartridge every few months. And I believe Dan has a filter on his home, and so he's probably the best guy to answer that. But yeah, again, if you mean treatment in general, get a water test first and then ask for advice from either a health department or a treatment professional. Some states regulate water treatment professionals that sell you treatment equipment. Some don't. And so, but your health department will be able to tell you that. So, Dan, Chuck, anything to add?
This is Dan. Yeah, I would start with like a 5-micron. Some people might have them clog up. I've also talked to people who've had a larger size and will complain that stuff gets through. That's why I start with that. On my personal well, I use a 5-micron, and it lasts me about 2 to 3 months. And then I'll start seeing a water pressure drop, and then I'll say, hey, it's time to change the filter. If you're just looking for a general all-purpose, something that takes out a lot of stuff, reverse osmosis is a pretty popular choice. You have to read about the exceptions. It doesn't solve everything, and usually people will want to put a water softener in front of it, and that'll take out hardness elements, and that is not really considered a filter, but it's a type of treatment that will take care of some potential problems. But it'll also add sodium to the water, so people may need to be concerned about that if they're on low sodium diets. There's always UV. A lot of people don't have UV systems or continuous chlorinators, but those are other possible things you might need to add. Iron filters are out there. A lot of softeners will take care of a lot of metals or cationic compounds like iron, but it really kind of depends on the form of the iron. One of our biggest complaints is about iron staining, so that's another thing you could consider is an iron filter.
All right, thanks.
This
Chuck?
is Chuck.
Yeah.
One thing that looked very intriguing was of having two filters and having a larger filter that's 50 microns, which would get out the big things, and then you could have another smaller filter at 25 or down to 5 microns to get the smaller stuff. So that way the big stuff wouldn't clog up your smaller filter, but you'd still get the smaller particles out.
Great. All right, thank you. Okay, so next question, what's the best way to remove arsenic from well water? And I actually got this from Dan and Chuck, so I'll let them go ahead.
Yeah, a lot of places are starting to show descriptions of adsorptive media, where I think it's an iron-based media that you can pass the water through. I haven't had a lot of experience talking with people about how effective those are, but in some talks that people, it sounds like they're pretty effective. Reverse osmosis is probably traditionally used, although sometimes we'll have some people in our own lab who submit samples and there won't be any reduction of arsenic after the reverse osmosis, so it's a little puzzling. And then we'll have other people that'll have complete removal of arsenic. And there's a couple different forms of arsenic out there. One's a reduced form, one's an oxidized form. You might see it referred to as arsenic 3 or arsenic 5. Generally, they say that the arsenic 5 is easier to remove, so often you might have to put some type of oxidation in front of it, like if you're talking about some continuous system, you might need to add a continuous chlorinator or a ozone or a green sand filter or something like that. Steve's got a nice reference here to this New Hampshire website. They've got a pretty good description of I think this has some other water treatment too, but also I think it has a good description of arsenic treatment.
Yeah, and it also describes like what's the difference between arsenic 3 and 5 and some other things. Yeah. So, well, and I think the deal with absorptive media, it's like many other treatment processes. You never, the idea of having UV for bacteria 15 years ago in a home well was pretty much unheard of, just because it was a new technology and communities were starting to use it as an alternative to chlorine, so that you didn't have disinfection byproducts and some of those issues. But now you're starting the same way with absorptive media. 10 or 12 years ago, a lot of those things were pretty new, and they were only going for community water supplies that had to meet the arsenic regulation. And now you're starting to see the costs come down and the sizes of these treatment plants, if you will, come down in size for a home system, because the technology's been out there now for a while. So, and that's good.
Yeah. Very good point, Steve.
Yeah.
Another option, which might be simpler, but it doesn't have huge capacity, is distillation. You wouldn't need any pre-treatment with that, but typically it doesn't have a huge flow rate. So it would be a point of use, just at one spot.
All right, thank you. Okay, so this was an interesting question. It said, if a pesticide was found in my well and remediated, I'm not exactly sure what they mean by remediated here. How often should I retest, and should I be testing treated or untreated water? Well, if the remediation was of the aquifer, so there's a contaminant and somebody's to blame, and so an engineering firm came in and they actually remediated took out the plume of contaminant, if you will. That's one situation. I would expect then that you should be able to get them, or whoever was found the responsible entity should have to test your water to make sure it remains safe and that it stays below levels. But if treatment was added at your home to remove that contaminant, then obviously you're only drinking the water after treatment, and that's the water you should test, because that means obviously the raw water probably still has that contaminant in it. And so it really depends on that situation. And again, if you've got your own treatment there for the water that's coming in, then you should be able to test it and determine that it's safe or clean, which is the water you're actually drinking. And so I said, how often really depends on the situation. If you are in a rural area, say you're in a farm like I grew up on, and you had a spill and it's near your well, I don't know what you meant by remediated there, so it makes it tough. But I would do it as often as I needed to be comfortable. And I understand that's not cheap, but if you've sampled several times and the water seems isn't showing any of those signs, I know, like, even for the EPA, what they require for sampling for community water supplies, they have to test. Every community's got to test for everything once. It's very expensive. But after they've tested several times and they show they don't have certain things, let's say they're in an area where there is no arsenic in the aquifer, so they never have an arsenic problem. It's always, well below 10, or maybe it's even 0. Then they can apply to be on reduced sample schedule for that contaminant. And so what happens then is maybe they only have to test once. Instead of every quarter, they only have to test once a year, every 2 years. And I would say, it's kind of that sort of mentality that I would take, because you want to have confidence that, one, the source is gone, whatever caused the problem, and two, then that, you want to make sure your family's safe if you're drinking the water. So that's how I would answer that. I don't remember if Dan or Chuck, you had anything there.
I think it was similar, Steve. That was a good answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. And again, these are questions we got this time for our talk. So how do wells become contaminated? That's actually a really good general question, because people forget, there's obvious pathways. Your well isn't above grade, or it's in a floodplain, and so there's a pathway into your well. Or your well, we've ran across wells that are actually dug and bored wells that are right in the middle of a cattle lot. And I don't mean a pasture where there's grass. I mean a feedlot next to a barn where it's all mud because there's so many cows that the grass can't grow. And, that's an obvious situation of where you're going to get contamination, because at that spot, water's seeping into the ground, it's infiltrating, and eventually it's going to make it to a shallow well. So if there's something obvious, a septic system can contaminate a well. There's a lot of things that can contaminate a well. But there's an issue for poor construction. That's where there's a pathway. Maybe your well has a crack in it, or the casing has cracks somewhere down at a shallow depth. And, that's another place where, shallow water is typically lower in chloride than very deep groundwater, just as a general rule. Not always, but a lot of times you see that. And when you see, I know some of the work we've done where we're taking a lot of samples over an area, that's one of the ways we find a recharge area for an aquifer, is you can see where the chlorides are lower. So if everybody else in your area has certain kind of water and yours is a little different, and it's, shows like it could have surface influence, then there's likely a pathway into your well from near the surface. And that's one of the most common ways that wells get contaminated. There are also naturally occurring contaminants. I mentioned arsenic. Arsenic is the 7th most common element in the Earth's crust. So it exists in a lot of places. Whether it's actually in the water is another story. I know in Illinois, we have an aquifer where it depends on how reduced the chemistry is. Certain types of chemistry, the arsenic stays bound to the minerals that make up the aquifer. And if it gets more reducing than that, then it gets released. And then you see it showing up in the water. And, it's a complicated chemical situation. Sometimes it's even biologically mediated. There are bacteria that are not harmful, like iron-reducing bacteria or methogenic bacteria that exist in groundwater at depth, so down in the aquifer. They may change the chemistry, basically, and cause things to be leached out. So There are many ways for a well to get contaminated. The good thing is most wells that are properly constructed and where the source water is a decent supply, many wells have no problem and they're safe and don't get bacteria in them and all those things. And it's a matter of you maintain your well properly, you test it annually to make sure everything's still the way it should be, and you can be confident that your well water's fine. So yeah. So the next question: what if I live near a cemetery? Well, again, it really becomes a cemetery, especially if it's a really old cemetery. There could be some sources there, I guess. I don't know a lot about that particular topic. But again, if you have a shallow dug or bored well or a really shallow well, even if it's a sand and gravel well or rock well, then there's certainly a risk of something moving from that part of the landscape towards your well. It's no different than a feedlot or a septic system or chemical storage or anything else. If it's a source and your well's shallow, or or the groundwater flow direction is from the source towards your well, it could become a problem. The best thing to do is ask your health department about that particular issue, and if there are any concerns. If the cemetery were upslope from where your well and your home are, then it would be a little more of a concern because runoff is probably that way. And typically the water table of the really shallow water that might not be in an aquifer, but it's the saturated part of the soil just below the ground, typically follows the landscape. And that's why water runs towards rivers and there are low spots and all that sort of thing. So that's my best answer there, without talking to someone who's an expert on water quality around cemeteries. What if my power goes out? We actually get this question fairly frequently, and I grew up in an area that was very rural. We actually, I'm going to date myself. In 1976, there was an ice storm. We were without power for 7 days. And we had a fireplace in a family room, and we also had a generator, even then, that would plug into our power pole so that we could run our freezer, our refrigerator, and keep the heat on, those sorts of things. You really need to realize a lot of things can happen with Mother Nature. Your power can go out for a lot of reasons, and if you're in a more remote area, you probably already have a generator, which is just necessary, especially if you have if it's a cold climate area where it may get below freezing at night and those sorts of things. Because what you don't want to happen is your power goes out and your pipes freeze. The well I grew up on, it was a shallow well, so our well pump was at the surface. We had pipes that then ran into the ground, and we had a little well house around it that was just made of wood. So if our power went out, our pipes would freeze and they'd bust. So we kept a propane tank down in that little well house, and every time the power went out, we ran it to keep that little room warm so the pipes didn't freeze. So there's a number of issues. Pumps run on electricity. There's no way around that. We're seeing a sort of a rejuvenation, if you will, of hand pumps. The old hand pumps that you used to have on farms and stuff. There are companies now that make those. Some that make a hand pump that fits into a regular sealed well cap, so you could replace your well cap and put a hand pump on there. I guess the verdict is still out on whether that's a good idea or not. It would allow you to have some water if you had no power, especially if you're in a climate where you don't have to worry about freezing. They are popular. I don't know a lot about them, but you can look online and look up hand pumps, and some states may have rules about having those on your well, but certainly in some states they're allowed because you're seeing a lot of them these days. What are the construction standards for private wells? As I said here, it totally depends on your location. I mentioned Alaska and Pennsylvania have no well construction codes, so in theory you can drill any kind of well you want. That obviously isn't the best approach, especially if you're in an area where you may have neighbors. If someone else isn't diligent about their well construction, they may actually be causing contamination to the same aquifer that you might be using. But in most states, there are construction codes that require certain types of pipe, certain types of depths. I know, for instance, you can put in a bored well in Illinois, but you have to have 10 feet of earth or clay material above where the bored well part starts, the large diameter part, and that's to help protect from surface infiltration. So, it just depends. Screens have to meet certain criteria. There's a lot of rules. Drillers have to be licensed so that they know what they're doing. And, you need to talk to look it up. The best way to do that would be to type your state construction code, well construction code, and you'll likely find it. And those folks, are very helpful. If you give them a call, they can give you that information. Most of it's online, and you want to follow code. And even if you have an old well and you're concerned, we would recommend that you bring an old well up to code, as I mentioned earlier, and that way you're more assured that your well is getting water from where it's supposed to, which is, if it's a sand and gravel well, let's say, as an example, you have a sand and gravel well that's 100 feet deep. Usually the screen is the bottom 5 feet or so of that. So that means all the water is coming into your well, if it's sealed properly, at 95 to 100 feet below land surface. That's much safer from surface contamination than a well that might be 20 feet deep or a sand point you put in with a sledgehammer, which some people do. So it's better to follow construction code. It's there the reason there is a code is to help ensure safety and public health protection and water quality. All right. I think this might be my last question. Can my well be shut down in the winter? Now, I didn't look this stuff up in advance. I ran out of time, to be honest, and I apologize. But if the person who asked this question, or if you have this issue, will email us. If you go to our website, it's info@privatewellclass.org. I will get you this information. Many states have procedures for startup and shutdown for a seasonal well. A lot of them are meant for non-community water supplies, which are regulated by the EPA, which means, a campground or something that's a seasonal type of retreat or whatever, or even a restaurant maybe that's, in a northern area where people go in the summer but no one's there in the winter. And so there's procedures for how to turn that off and protect your pipes and make sure that your water quality is fine for both when you shut that down and when you bring it back up. You don't want to leave it on, especially if you're not there. You saw that picture with the well with the fire. You start melting wires together and all of a sudden your pump may run and you're going to burn up your pump, right? So you want to make sure that if you can turn the power off to your pump when you're not there, and that your water is still protected, or what procedures you might use. So if you just email us, we can provide that information, and I apologize for not having that here, but it's a really good question. There's a lot of people that have a seasonal home, Door County, Wisconsin, or northern New Hampshire, or, wherever, northern New York. So it's certainly a worthwhile thing to get at. Okay, quickly, I want to talk a little bit about the private well class. So there's 10 lessons. You sign up online. I'll show you that in a second. And it's much more detailed than we can provide here in a webinar. And the idea, it's free. It's funded all again through US EPA. You sign up. It sends you a lesson once a week by email for 10 weeks. It walks you through, here's how water gets in your well from the ground, through all the way through, why is my pump cycling on and off repeatedly 6 times in an hour, some of the maintenance issues, to emergency situations, what to do, and treatment and sampling and all those things. So it's much more detailed, and it's really meant to be a way for you to become a better steward, if you will, of your well and your water quality. And we certainly, if you're not taking the class or haven't, we certainly recommend you do that and share that with other folks. This is what our webpage looks like today. On the left at the bottom, learn by email. Click there. It'll take you to the enroll in class page. We also have podcasts we've started. So far, we only have the first 3 lessons, but we're going to do the rest. And there's also videos, which are like 3 or 4 minute long videos about a specific topic, like what is an artesian aquifer? How can I protect my well from this? What do I do if I've had a fire? Answering specific questions. And there's about 20 of those videos that are up so far, and in the end there'll be 35 to 40 that we're developing. And so there's a lot of good information here. This is the enrolling class. All it asks is for your email address, your first name, and where you live as a drop-down for the state. And that's really so that we can ensure that we're reaching out to everyone in the country. That's our job, if you will. from EPA is to make sure this is a national program and that we're reaching out to the right places. And so it'll send you one lesson every week. And as I mentioned, this is the videos page. At the top, it shows this is the webinar from January 2016, which is one of the first ones we did. We've recorded every webinar we've done. And so you can go back and find all those. If you scroll down this page, it shows you both the webinars on the right and all the informational videos I just mentioned on the left. You know, it talks about what is an aquifer, difference of bedrock aquifer versus a sand and gravel aquifer, all those things. How do wells get contaminated? That question was asked today. And then for each of the 10 lessons, what we did when we built this class is we used a lot of other resources that are out there that we felt were really good and would be useful for well owners. So for each lesson, which lesson 1 is called The Science of Groundwater, there are 9 or 10 sources that are all publicly available and usually some sort of state or federal agency on that topic that help reinforce the information that's in there. Now, a lot of times these documents are where some of the figures came from that we used in developing the class. So they're really worth looking at. It's one of the comments we get back from people who've taken our class. A lot of them are like, these resources are great. Thanks for providing them. It really gives you a chance if you want to learn more about that topic, how to do that. So the goal of our class and all the information we're providing really is for you to understand as a well owner why your well is important. It's not only important to you and your family for your health, but also to your neighbor and to source water protection of the aquifers and the environment in general. So you understand how it works, and that'll enable you to better protect yourself from risk. And that's really where we're at with all this. So we're going to take a couple-minute break. Probably won't be 5 minutes, so we can look over the questions that you might have provided while I've been talking, and then we will go through some of those, and I'll pull up a Google Doc to get to that. So just hang on. All right, we've got, looks like 3 or 4 questions here. I'm just going to pull those over. Hopefully everybody can see that. And these are the questions we've gotten so far. If you have anything else you'd like to ask, we certainly can get to that. So I'm going to zoom this in. Tell me if that's okay. Okay. So what states do have, I've got everybody unmuted, I think. Okay. Well, what states do have private well standards and testing requirements? Well, really, no state has testing requirements for private wells, other than there's a couple states now, New Jersey, Oregon, and maybe one other, that have a testing requirement for a private well when there's a sale of property. A lot of banks or lending agencies might have some of those requirements. FHA, HUD, I guess that is FHA, rural development, and VA loans for homes. They have rules that say you'll get it tested, but I don't believe just for testing for the sake of you have to test your well water to make sure it's safe. I mentioned earlier, and I need to look into this, but I know there are a couple counties on the East Coast where they passed a county law that basically says, you know, your well water has to meet the EPA's drinking water standards. But it's, yeah, I don't know which ones those are. But there's no state requirements at all. It's up to you as a well owner. You're free to drink your water no matter what's in it over almost all the country. So as far as private well standards, those are usually construction standards that say it has to meet certain criteria. You know, ASTM standards for the pipe, or the depth for running the pipe in the house and the type of pipe you use, certain things you can't use when you're drilling the well, certain types of drilling fluid, you know, it has to be a licensed driller, all those sorts of things. Nearly every state has those rules. Now, I mentioned earlier these standards are different in each state, and they came online, so to speak, in different times. So that means, like in Illinois, since the early 60s, if you drill a well, you have to get a permit from the county, and then you have to file the log after you've drilled the well, the driller does, on behalf of the landowner, and those records end up here at the State Water Survey. So we have 400,000 or 500,000 well logs of all the wells that have been drilled in the state, and we probably only have half or less of the logs for actual wells that are in use. There's probably closer to 1 million wells in use in Illinois, and we don't have logs for half of them. But in some states, those laws weren't passed as early. Like in New York State, they didn't pass a law requiring you to file a log until 2000. So every well drilled in New York before 2000, the state may not have a record of. And so it's much more likely they don't have 90% or so of the well records to identify where wells might be or any construction information on how those were constructed. In Mississippi, they have well construction code and rules, but they have an exemption. If your well is 5 inches in diameter or less, you don't have to file a log. So that's most private wells. And so the state or even the counties don't have records for nearly all the private wells in their state, but they do for all the larger diameter wells. It might be for community or industrial use or whatever, irrigation, all those sorts of things. So you'd have to look at your state. Again, if you just Google, like for Wisconsin, if you say Wisconsin water well code, it'll come up with their DNR's website and give you that information, and you can get a contact there and go about it in that respect. If you would rather have us do the legwork, we probably can. If you send us an email about where you're at and who you are, we could probably get the right contact for you. So what about sampling for pesticides or VOCs? Well, typically those aren't as widespread a threat, especially the VOCs. There's usually has to be a source if you have an underground tank, some of those things, or if you're in an area where there may have been industrial use of some sort. And as far as pesticides, they've become a lot safer than they used to be even 25, 30 years ago. A lot of those have been banned. In most cases they're applied, and the way they're applied, it's so it can't contaminate an aquifer per se. The real risk is if there's a leaky, you're storing in a barn and one of your tanks leaks, or you're mixing your sprayer using a hose and you drop it in the tank. That's a really bad idea, because as soon as you shut your water supply off, it back siphons and it can get in your well. So that you're supposed to have backflow preventers. That's a best practice. All those sorts of things. In general, if you really want to sample for peace of mind, it's fairly expensive to test for those. But probably your health department can tell you what are the most common of those that you might be concerned about, depending on where you're at. If you're in an area that grows a lot of potatoes, it's a lot different type of pesticide than if you're in an area that's corn and soybeans. So it really matters. Or cotton, they all have different types of things that might be a concern or historically been a concern. I guess that's my best advice, is ask your health department if they have seen anything, if anyone else has had any problems. That's another way to check on that. So some pediatricians are advising parents that their infants should not be drinking well water. Please advise. Well, I would say that's only the case if you haven't tested your water. The one real risk for babies and pregnant women, babies under a year old, is nitrate. So if you're drinking water that has nitrate, which is fairly common, especially in agricultural areas at higher than background levels, the nitrate forms nitrite. In adults and older folks, your body can break that down, but in babies, their stomachs aren't acidic enough, is my understanding, to break it down. So the nitrite basically takes the place of oxygen in your blood and binds those sites up, and that's why it's called blue baby syndrome. That's got a really long name that I don't remember. But so that's just a safety precaution. If you haven't tested, I'm sure that pediatricians see this happen once in a while. But if you are diligent and you sample your well water and your well's properly constructed and you're sure there's no sources nearby, your well water should be fine. But the only way it's fine is if you've tested it and it's fine, not if you just assume it's fine. So what about nitrate testing? Is this something one should do in an ag area in the Midwest? Certainly. And just, so in Illinois, I've been here at the Water Survey almost 30 years, and we've done a lot of research looking at ag chemicals, arsenic, nitrate, other things in well water in Illinois. We did a study looking at just dug and bored wells, which are the most vulnerable because the water's coming from shallower areas. And we also did an ag study for the State Department of Agriculture where we sampled wells at different depths with aquifers of different depths. So you assume a shallow aquifer is going to be more at risk than a deeper aquifer to surface contamination. And in doing that, it really played out just that way. The dug and bored wells and really shallow wells, we saw more instances of high nitrate and at least detections of pesticides than we did in deeper wells. And the best example, one of the areas we picked had a very deep aquifer for being sand and gravel. It was started at about 250 feet below land surface, and there was 100 feet of clay above it. So the clay basically acts as an aquitard and doesn't let water through or very fast. And it's the one place and the one aquifer in the state where we found nitrate to be just background or nearly zero. And that's because it has absolutely no influence from all the nitrate that's been applied for the last 100 years in Illinois. Manure is also high in nitrate, so certainly ag areas are more susceptible. And if you have a shallow well, or if you're in a sandy area where there's a sand point, or you put in a sand point for your water supply, we don't recommend that, but I know a lot of people do it, then you definitely want to test your well for nitrate. All right. So there's been a recent uptick in earthquake activity here in central Oklahoma. I saw that, actually. What should I be looking for when evaluating my well from earthquake damage? If it has a different color, taste, texture, anything different in that respect, it might be worth taking a sample anyway. I know we don't have many earthquakes in Illinois, but there's a fault in Missouri, and last year or 2 years ago that created a small earthquake there. We were able to monitor the water level change from the earthquake causing a change in water levels at several of our wells that we have continuous recording equipment on. And so it certainly can impact things. They're mostly smaller earthquakes, but it can also, enough shaking could cause either a weld to break if it's a steel well casing, or a joint to break if it's PVC. If hopefully you have a water sample that you can use as your starting point. But if you see a change, this is one of those things I mentioned earlier, why you sample for so many constituents every 3 to 5 years. Maybe it would show that now all of a sudden some of your water is coming from a shallower unit or that sort of thing. I don't know your situation as far as how deep your well is, but if it doesn't look like there's any damage, and it's just, the more things you do, the more comfortable you feel about it and the safer you feel about it. Yes. Can the well casing be compromised by earthquake activity? It certainly can be, especially if it's a larger earthquake. Again, wells aren't put in as one long big piece of steel pipe or PVC pipe. They're either welded or cemented or screwed together. And so any kind of shaking in the ground, that sort of thing, could cause one of those welds to break loose, just like anything else over time, especially if the well's older. They've been susceptible to the elements in the ground all that time. Eventually wells do wear out. Sometimes screens fail and you start getting sand. That's just long-term chemistry acting on your well. So if anything's been weakened at all, then an earthquake could come along. As far as how you would tell, again, your water chemistry would be one of your best indicators if it's changed. And, nowadays they even make cameras that a person can buy. Not that anyone would want to do that, but they're much more affordable for, even like a county sanitarian or a county health department could afford a camera that they could put down a well, and you could obviously look at it that way. I'm not suggesting a private well owner do that, but you might have a driller who has one who might be willing to do that for you, or you can do it for a fee. I know some drillers do have those. Certainly major leaking from the walls into the well. If you could see that, then yeah. Just be sure if it's not condensation. All the moisture that's naturally in a well can cause, especially near the top where you might be able to see with a flashlight, you typically see a lot of moisture on the outside or on the inside walls of a well. And so it might not be leaking. It might just be natural condensation. So, okay, I have never had nitrates, and this year we had a ton of rain. How can I get my nitrate level to go down? So you have high nitrates now. It could be a temporary thing if it's never happened before. Just from flushing, maybe someone applied something to a field nearby just with poor timing for when it rained. And we had a lot of rain in December this year. Some guys fall apply still their nitrate, their nitrogen, So I don't know of a way to get it down other than to monitor it and see if it goes down. I don't think just pumping your well a lot is going to change that. If it's from a more non-point source, like because of all the rain, it's pulled it from farm fields and that sort of thing, it's way more than you could ever pump out. So you might need to consider treatment if that's the case, and it's likely that if it is a more regional, if you will, or non-point problem, another well is probably going to have the same issue that's at the same depth. So the last question here, I have a customer that has been having high coliform. They have bleached a couple of times. They still have coliform. As I mentioned before, there are some, if it just started and their well was fine for many years, then it's likely there's a breach in the well somewhere near the surface. I mean, unless it's a shallow well to begin with, then that means that there's some contaminant nearby that's found a pathway to get in the well. So if there's any kind of source nearby, a septic or drain field, it could be something even like they haven't pumped their septic tank for the last 10 years, which if they don't do that regularly, eventually your septic lines are going to clog. And, there's several ways that you find out your septic isn't working properly anymore. One, you have this nasty, real green, wet area where your septic field is supposed to be, or you might have it back up into your basement. But other than that, if your septic isn't working properly, then it could be causing that waste from your house to get more concentrated near your well. That could be one cause. The bottom line is if they continue to chlorinate and it doesn't help, then the only way to make the water safe is to continuously chlorinate or, again, add UV. And going back to what Chuck and Dan were talking about earlier with different kinds of treatment systems, I think we were talking about absorptive media. UV is becoming much more common. And I think, I know like in Tennessee and Kentucky and southern Illinois and those areas, southern Indiana, you're starting to see a lot of folks who use springs in Pennsylvania area that, like I said, who might use springs for their water supply. Usually what you do is you create a holding tank like a cistern for your spring water, and then you need to treat it because it's basically surface water and it's very likely to have bacterial contamination. Some people, especially in the country, don't like chlorinated water. They don't want to deal with the taste of chlorine. City water tastes like a swimming pool, people will say, that sort of thing. So they use UV instead. They do have home UV systems. They're just more to maintain and they're more expensive. But you're able to treat for bacteria and the added benefit of killing viruses and those sorts of things, or they can, without having that chlorine residual. Ensures that you've killed all the bacteria. Plus, now we know there's an issue with too much chlorine, or chlorine can degrade into these disinfection byproducts that have shown to be harmful in some cases. So you see communities, that's why some of them are going to UV or going to other treatment after chlorination to get rid of the disinfection byproducts. So treatment might be the best option. Like for the folks in New York, I recommended that unless they can get on a community water supply, they're always going to have bacteria problems. It's just the nature of the aquifer that their water comes from, and it's their only source. They can't go deeper. They can't go somewhere else. They have one aquifer, and it's contaminated with E. coli because of all the septic systems that are so close together. They really have to go on community water, or they need to have a continuous chlorinator in order to protect that and make sure they're killing all the bacteria. Dan and Chuck, anything you want to add? I think that's our last question. I might have you guys muted. I do. Sorry. Now you can.
Hey, no problem. Okay.
Yeah.
I just thought of something on another small note on the bacteria. If as far as bleaching, I've talked to some health department people, and they've mentioned it might take several treatments to get rid of a particularly high or nuisance problem. What you could look for is to see if the count goes down each time, and especially if it's getting close to zero, there might be just sort of background material that maybe one more treatment would take care of it. Another thing is, I don't remember if you touched on this or not, Steve, but if they've bleached it and it hasn't made contact with every line in their house, what they say is to make sure they run it through all the lines, even if there's make sure you don't forget about any lines, because it could be a source for a colony to grow again. Just a couple points like that.
Yeah, I completely forgot to mention that. Yeah, when you know, disinfecting your well isn't just about putting chlorine or even a mixture in your well water. It's then running all the lines in your house, every shower, every toilet, every possible line, until you smell chlorine coming out of the tap, and then you let it sit. So this is another story, but we had frogs in our well when I was growing up. So we disinfected everything. We cleaned out the entire well. We sprayed it out with a pressure washer full of chlorinated water, and then we ran that water into our house and did it in the evening, and then you run it through every single line so that you smell chlorine and you know the water that's in each of those lines, even your spigots outside, so that you can smell the chlorine, and then you let it sit overnight so it has time to actually be effective and kill the bacteria. And if you don't do that, then you're likely going to continue to have a problem. And if you look at the Minnesota documentation, I haven't honestly looked at the new, shorter version of what they put out, but I'm pretty sure it would say, you know, this is what you need to do, and it's recommended for a number of hours, but it's best if you just let it go overnight. Then you're, you know, giving it more time to do its job.
I don't know about coliform bacteria, but iron bacteria, sometimes you can have a colony, a slime layer, and sometimes physically cleaning is necessary to get that, because the chlorine won't be able to penetrate, and then you can have a recurring problem.
And that's a good point. And, you know, and that's another area where I don't have a lot of expertise, but I know there's a lot of issues. Even, you know, all the problems with lead pipes, sometimes you don't see any lead because of that layer, or there's been some kind of coating basically on the pipes, and then you change the chemistry somehow, like add some kind of treatment so the chemistry is different, and it sloughs that stuff away, and now all of a sudden the lead's exposed and it causes problems. So, you know, like I said, I'd have to I'd probably call the folks at EPA in Cincinnati that have a lot more experience with that stuff, but we can certainly look into it if you're interested. All right, well, there's no other questions, and we went to 2:30 Central Time, so I appreciate everyone who's still on the call, and if you have any other questions, you can email us or contact us. I know we use GoToWebinar, and it'll send you a little thing saying thanks for attending. If you respond to that, it'll come right to me. So feel free. Again, thanks again for attending. And next month, I believe our webinar is for sanitarians. And so it'll be 2 months before we have a webinar for well owners. But if you look at our website, right at the top of the page, it says webinars and events. Click there. It'll tell you the schedule for all that. So thank you again, and have a good day.